It was my grandfather who first told me about the giant of Congleton Pike, and I can honestly say that as a child, the idea absolutely terrified me. As the date he mentioned approached and I grew older, that fear never quite faded. Sure, I got older and more cynical. I disregarded all of Morton's tales of spooks and ghosts, cryptids and witches, but somehow that story, the one about the giant that wandered the moor, feeding on the flesh of hikers and emerging from his lair every 37 years to eat his fill, stayed with me, the date carved into my mind like an etching in runes upon some ancient stone. I suppose before I tell you what happened though, I should probably set the scene. The small northern town of Morton is not an enclave surrounded by a network of other similar-sized towns or nestled somewhere on the coast, though it does perhaps seem at times as if the entire place is adrift upon an open sea of grassland. As the name suggests, Morton is bordered on almost every side by an open expanse of moor. There are, to the north, thick woodlands that rise up the hills and dales and undulating hills that climb out of the valley onto massive expanses of farmland. After that, though, the terrain becomes far more rugged, the hills covered in thick gorse, reeds, wildgrass and peat bogs. Once you go past a certain point, you are on the moor. The moorland, I have been told since I was a child, is a dangerous place. Though it holds no immediate danger of predators like the national parks in, say, America, or pretty much anywhere in Australia, it is the nothing itself that is the threat. With no landmarks to cling to, no distinguishing features for the hiker or traveller to find their way, and nowhere to shelter when the weather, changeable and capricious as it is, turn back to attack you, the moors are disorienting. It is a hostile place, and if you get lost or turned around up there, something which is very easy to do, then the moor, as my mother would say, will take you. Every few years the moor does take people. They die of exposure, or they fall and injure themselves whilst trying to navigate through one of the quickly descending fogs. British mountain rescue teams are called upon almost weekly to look for people who travel too far from the set paths, not realising how dangerous and how treacherous those grasslands can be. Over the years there have been many injuries and many casualties. There have also been those who have gone out onto the moors and simply never come back. Now I know it might sound strange that in this day and age, such a thing could be possible, but you have to remember that the moor is full of what we call goals. These are craters that simply fall away from the flat surface of the land. There are also ravines, narrow crevices that can be unseen in the mist or the dark. If someone is desperately trying to find their way back to town across this featureless landscape, then there are the peat bogs and swamps that become like quicksand after heavy rains, trapping the unwary with sucking vacuums of trapped air that pull them down within it, so that they are forever lost. Whilst you might think that it would be impossible to lose someone up there in this day and age, it should be remembered that the infamous Moors murders Myra Hindley and Ian Brady buried their child victims up on the moors, and a number of them have never been found despite authorities knowing roughly the geographical area where they might be. The moor, in short, is a wild and hostile place, and a place that sometimes takes people, particularly at intervals of 37 years. It is no real surprise then, considering the rugged and inhospitable nature of this place, that stories and legends should rise and form within the swirls of mists that cling to the moor. Indeed, there are several different tales that mesh and overlap, many of them told within the town of Morton itself. One of the most infamous, because of course it is possible to point to some tangential or circumstantial evidence of its truth, is the giant of Congleton Pike. The Pike, I should explain, is one of the highest hills bordering upon a mountain in the area, and is where the majority of the sightings have been made. Much like the infamous Grey Man of the Cairngorm Mountains in Scotland, this figure, reportedly seen striding across the moors in the fog, had been explained away by scientists as a trick of the light. An optical illusion created by the water in the air bending the light to make things in the distance look far bigger than they actually are. What this compelling explanation does not explain, of course, is how this image, apparently just another hiker distorted by the trick of the light, crosses impossibly huge portions of the moor in just a few strides. It also doesn't explain the disappearances. My grandfather, of course, had his own explanation for those, and strange as it might sound, it is this explanation that I am inclined to believe. My grandfather worked for the mountain rescue for years, but says that he has seen the giant only twice, and even then only from a distance. In his version of the tale, the creature appears on the moor only once every 37 years. It emerges during periods of mist and stalks slowly across the lonely grasslands, seen only as an enormous outline of a thing many times too large to be a man. Biologists, with at least some knowledge and open-mindedness, might comment upon how, in every description, the creature is said to have a ridge or crest on top of its head, a protruding slope similar to that of a gorilla. Now, if the sketches drawn over many centuries were to be examined, a serious naturalist might point out that this large crest is called a sagittal crest, and gorillas have it in order to support the musculature of their huge jaws. It acts like an anchor to allow the weight of the jaw used for snapping and grinding vegetation to work properly. That this detail is included on drawings of the giant made in the 1700s, well before the first specimens of gorillas were ever seen in Europe, is curious. How would the people of that time be able to record this similarity between this creature and a great ape if the entire idea of a gorilla was unknown? A biologist might also note that in all the old drawings, the giant is said to have an enormous pot belly. Again, this is similar to gorillas, who use the extra space in this cavity to digest the vegetation over a very long time. Where the descriptions differ, of course, is in the teeth, as the giant is said to have fangs, the size of daggers, and to feed exclusively on meat. This would fit with the large stomach, as it would be needed for digesting blood, meat, and bone. Of course, naturalists don't actually take the report seriously, or they didn't until 2022 when the cycle rolled around again. As a child, when my grandfather would tell me about the creature, I would always picture it as some distortion of the ogre I had seen in the Jack and the Beanstalk books. An image that, though it was meant for children, still scared me. There was something about the ogre's huge black beard, the wild staring eyes, and the ruby red lips around those rows of gigantic teeth that terrified me. Especially when I turned the page and saw a man being dangled over that yawning mouth, or heard that the ogre could smell an Englishman's blood and threatened to grind his bones to make his bread. I was reassured by my grandfather's assurance that the giant only came out every 37 years, and that the last incident had been 4 years before. But that only served to start a timer in my head, ticking down the days and months until the next cycle was due. Even as a serious, right-minded adult, I remember thinking on the New Year's Eve of 2022 that this will be the year, as if the knowledge had been drummed into me. It was only when the first hiker went missing in February that the fear really caught up with me, though. 1 in February and 2 in March, not injured or lost, but vanished, completely and without a trace. I remember there was a gap over the summer. Less mist, my grandfather would say, but that during that time, instead of the mist, the rumours swirled and eddied. Tales of how the thing had been spotted by farmers, its massive head, the size of a family car, protruding out over the layer of thick grey mist. How there had been footprints found that were meters in length and several meters apart, and how sheep, cows, and even horses had gone missing in recent months. Never recovered or found dead upon the moor. Just vanished, and the rumour went, consumed. It was only in November of last year that I went up there. In probably the greatest of ironies, considering how I had held this legend in my head for decades, I was assigned by my department to search portions of the moor for the remains of the missing hikers. As part of the pathology team, I took up some fairly sophisticated equipment. Methane probes would indicate if there was something rotting below the surface, and crucially radar equipment to allow us to see under the surface of the moor and down multiple layers to check if anything large or hard had been buried. We did not find a body, but on Congleton Pike we did find something far more interesting. Using the underground scanning equipment, we surveyed the area under the moor to see where the ground was less dense, where there might be bog or any large objects hiding under the first layer. What we found was that not only was nothing hiding below the surface, there was a whole lot of nothing. Hundreds upon hundreds of feet of it. Under Congleton Pike was a cave. The entire hill was hollow, around 5 meters below. The surface was nothing but a vast expanse of caverns similar to those in other nearby areas that had been quarried for coal, slate, and the precious stone Blue John. These caverns, which according to the slim pictures we could get from the radar images, stretched out and down for miles, branched off into what looked like a network of tunnels, like rabbit warrens, that led further and further down. It was a space never explored, but also one where my mind continued to scream something very large could hide, emerging only once every 37 years to hunt and to feed. Over the course of 2022, over 60 domestic farm animals were reported vanished from the area around Moorton. In addition to that, 6 hikers who set out for the hills in and around Moorton and especially Congleton Pike were reported missing. In early 2024, a geographical survey team plans to explore the newly discovered caverns below the Pike to send cavers down there to see what could be under there. I hope and pray that when the exploration starts, they find nothing but acres of bare and uninhabited rock. I hope what they find is nothing. I hope so, but I am far from confident.